Hey guys, so excited y'all are here with me today for our third and final week of our series titled Bittersweet. If you haven't heard, my name is Mia. I am one of the PTSM interns here for the summer, so if I haven't gotten the chance to meet you, I definitely want to meet you after this. And today we're just going to kind of talk about how healing and forgiveness is a process that takes time. So to get started, I want you all to think about a time that you've ever obtained a physical injury of sorts. Now this might sound silly, but humor me for a second. Raise your hand if you've ever fallen off a bike. Most of us probably, right? Raise your hand if you've ever gone so hard in a game of basketball that you fall and scrape your arm or leg in only the way that concrete can hurt, right? That burn, ouch. Raise your hand if you were the kid at Camp Eagle who slipped on a rock in front of your entire group and probably cut your arm or leg, right? It happens to the best of us. But there's something that all of these injuries have in common, no matter how severe they are. There's a healing process. First, you need pressure to stop any bleeding that's happening, right? Then you might need to clean out a wound, allow time for blood clots to form and skin to repair. If it's really severe, you might even need time to heal a broken bone, right? But the key is that healing process takes time. And in the same way that physical healing takes time, so does emotional healing. No matter how severe, right, the emotional damage that somebody causes you is, there's a healing process that has to occur. And when you're hurt by somebody that you truly care about, right, this healing process and this process of forgiveness quickly becomes a multi-step thing. And it cannot, nor should it, happen all at once. You're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days, right? When you're trying to forgive somebody, you're going to have days where forgiveness comes really easy and simple. You're going to have days where forgiveness is anything but easy and simple. You might have days where you feel like you've fully forgiven somebody and you're completely over it. And then months or years down the road, there's a trigger that brings back all of those negative feelings once again. Now, hear me when I say, if this is you, first know that you're not doing anything wrong. Second, know that this is a natural human response, and it's exactly what we're going to dive into and explore today. So today you're going to see a story that highlights discourse within a family, one that leads to a lot of assumed tension between brothers, and we're going to learn how they navigated their life and how we can take what they did and apply it to our own stories. We're going to start, if you want to flip, to Genesis 25. Esau and Jacob. Now, if you haven't heard this story before, Esau is the older brother of Jacob, and therefore he was given many birthrights that Jacob didn't have simply because he was the oldest. However, as most of us would be, Jacob was quick to kind of be furious and acknowledge that he wanted those birthrights for himself. He didn't just want to leave those with Esau, right? Over time, because of this anger that he didn't have these birthrights, Jacob began to deceive Esau and convince him to trade away some of these birthrights that Jacob so desperately wanted. If you keep flipping a little bit farther to Genesis 27, Jacob doesn't just stop at trying to deceive Esau, he goes as far as to deceive his father. And he convinces his father to let him steal all of the blessings that were originally meant for Esau. Now, this is kind of a big deal, right? This isn't just like I borrowed my sister's shirt or I, took my brother's game controller, right? Like, this is like the family birthright that was bestowed upon Esau that Jacob has now stolen. If you go to Genesis 27:41, you see exactly what happens as a result of this betrayal. It says, Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, and then I will kill my brother Jacob. Whew, it's kind of serious, right? That's not just like I'm going to steal something back, or I'm not going to talk to him for a little bit. He straight up death threats his brother. Now, following this, obviously we can tell that Esau was furious, right, as he should be, which in turn caused Jacob to fear for his life. Jacob was not only scared, though. Once he got wind of this death threat, he ended up fleeing home for over 20 years. It's kind of a long time, right? Now, most people, as did Jacob, would rightfully assume that 20 years later, after receiving a death threat from your brother, right, there would still be a lot of tension and a lot of anger present. And one of the interesting parts about this story is that in this 20 years, Jacob did spend so much time considering what Esau was going to think about him when they finally reunited. Thankfully, we do get to see exactly what happens during this reunion. If you go to Genesis 33, starting in verse 1, it says, Jacob looked up, and there was Esau. Now, remind you, this is 20 years after their original conflict, coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, Rachel and Joseph in the rear, and he himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. So we're 20 years after the initial conflict. Jacob's already like, man, like what's gonna happen when I see Esau? Like I'm a little nervous. And he gets to this reunion, and he's not just met with Esau, but he's met with these 400 other men as well. Now, if I'm you, I'm probably like, man, like what kind of fight am I getting myself into, right? Like if you're seeing your sibling or your friend for the first time that long and they bring 400 people as backup, that's kind of intimidating, right? And so Jacob is still assuming that he's about to be met with so much anger. But if we continue just to verse 4, it says, but Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Wait a second, that's not how we would have imagined this situation going. That's not how Jacob imagined the situation going, right? He assumed that there would be all this tension, there would be all this anger, but instead, Esau, instead of meeting him with revenge, meets him with reconciliation, right? He throws his arm around him, and he's just happy to have his brother back home. This is kind of a crazy example of like what forgiveness over time can do. And so to kind of add to this story, I want to tell you a little bit about my personal life. My family has gone through a lot in the past couple years, and specifically last year, I can remember there was a time where my house was filled with so much assumed tension. There was this looming cloud of just like tension and anger that rested over my household to the point where you could not walk into a room without feeling it, right? We noticed it, our friends who came over noticed it, and it was honestly kind of scary. And it got to the point where we were all entering conversations with so much assumed tension and with the idea that regardless of what the situation was, it was going to end poorly. Now, that, I can tell you, is not a very healthy way to start a conversation, because if both parties are already going in assuming the worst, that conversation is never going to be civil, right? We would immediately skip the pleasantries and jump to like the screaming fights. It got to the point where I was so nervous to walk into my house that when I got home from school, I would stop in the driveway. And I would take a deep breath and I'd process and think like, okay, I'm about to walk in and this is not gonna be good. Now, mind you, I haven't been home for 8 hours. I have no idea what's gonna greet me on the other side of the door, right? But I was so scared of this tension that I was assuming would be present. What helped me ended up being me moving away to college, physically distancing myself, giving myself time and space away from this environment so that when I came back, those relationships could be mended. But it took a while. And I think this is a lot of what Jacob and Esau were going through. So there's 3 main points I want you to understand about our stories today. The first is that when we live under assumed tension, we create a distance where afraid already exists. Now, Jacob, from our story, is the one who hurt Esau. However, Jacob is the same person who cannot let that hurt go. He thinks about it and thinks about it for over 20 years, right? Not knowing that Esau has already processed and moved on. He's so stuck on the pain that he caused that he creates this assumed tension that causes him to believe Esau can only receive him poorly. And this tension that Jacob so assumed, however, was not the tension that Esau brought and met him with. Now, I think this is relatable because we often have the longest and hardest battles that we face in our minds. We're replaying things like conversations that we had, anticipated rejection and just the fear of what's going to happen, a lot of just assumed anger around people and conversations that we haven't even had yet, right? And we begin building a defense around a conflict without even knowing if the conflict still exists. Now for me, this was my big deep breath in the driveway, building my defense, preparing to go in and fight a battle before even knowing what that battle was or what I was going to be met with, right? For you, this could be avoiding a confrontation, right? A friend hurts you and you don't want to have that conversation, you don't want to address that, so you just kind of move on. And then that friend continues to do the same thing over and over again because they didn't realize it hurt you and you won't say anything about it. This turns into grudges and frustrations, right? When we live under assumed tension, we create a distance where afraid already exists. The second thing I want you to take away from this is that time provides room for forgiveness to grow. We've been talking a lot about the past several weeks about how forgiveness is a choice before it's ever a feeling. You might not feel like forgiving right away, but you can make the choice to forgive and then later get the feeling of forgiveness. Now, I know that a lot of actions that require forgiveness are extremely painful. In order for you to need to forgive somebody close to you, it means that they did something in some form or fashion that did hurt you. And I hear that and I see that, right? And that can make forgiveness difficult. And because of that, it's perfectly healthy to forgive somebody and then also establish boundaries. Now, boundaries are things that can help protect you and protect your peace and keep you from putting yourself in the same painful situation again. These boundaries can often look like two big things, which might seem simple, but they're just time and space. Now, for me, obviously, this time and space was the physical distance I got when I moved off to college. It was time away from my household, time away to allow me to process and then later come back to those relationships. In the story, it was the case of Jacob and Esau and how time passed, distance passed, and healing was able to be established, right? Esau needed time to process the hurt that Jacob had caused him, and Jacob needed time to process the person he was becoming and how to reconcile with Esau. For you, this might be stepping away from a friendship for a little bit and allowing time to heal some old wounds. I also do understand, though, that you may be currently living with the person you need to forgive. It could be a sibling, it could be a parent, and time and space away from this person is near impossible. And so for that, I want to tell you, one, that this is not your fault, and two, that it will get better. Eventually, some way or somehow, you will get your time and space. But in the meantime, I encourage you to find other escapes. Maybe it's a good book that allows you to draw yourself out of your world for just a minute and move somewhere else, right? Maybe it's a sport or an instrument that for a couple hours a day, you can just concentrate on something that's not the relationships in your life. But regardless of how you do it, I encourage you to know that time will provide room for forgiveness to grow. My third and final point I want you to hear today is that forgiveness can end hostility, but it does not require the same level of access. Now, in our story, after their successful reunion, all seems well between the two brothers, right? But what you haven't heard, and it goes on to say in Genesis, is that the brothers, yes, reunited, but they still chose to go their separate ways and live separate lives, right? They didn't have the same level of connection as before because they did walk through a serious hurt, and there is still time that's needed in that healing process. For me, this turned into my decision to be much more insistent on having conversations when I came home from college. I knew the tension that was there my senior year of high school, and so when I moved back home this summer, I was insistent on not letting things be assumed, having conversations and getting to the real truth instead of just assuming a fight. For you, I would encourage you to forgive, yes, but then if you need those boundaries like we talked about before, to separate that level of connection and that level of access from somebody, know that's healthy, and that's a proper strategy that you can most definitely take. I also want you to consider the flip side on if you choose not to forgive somebody, because one of two things will happen. The first, if you choose not to forgive somebody, right, you are constantly going to avoid a relationship that you once deeply cared about. Now hear me when I say there are also some actions and some choices that seem unforgivable, right? And I understand that level of pain because it really is deep. And this is why we discussed forgiveness with boundaries as well. But if you continue to avoid a relationship because you're scared of forgiveness, you're simply just going to keep pushing away somebody you once cared about. The second option, if you choose not to forgive, is you'll sweep it under the rug. You'll avoid it, it'll look fine in the moment, right? But it'll always resurface in a future relationship. We say the phrase that hurt people, and this is because they take learned behaviors from harmful relationships that they don't address, and later, whether consciously or subconsciously, apply it to future relationships. And this happens when you don't take the time to work through issues and process and forgive. So forgiveness can end hostility, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need the same level of access with those people. Now, the reason I think this story is so powerful is because it's a situation that most of us can kind of apply to our own lives in some form or fashion, right? You may not have had a family feud of sorts like Jacob and Esau did, but I bet you if you think deeply, you've had friendship drama. You've had power struggles between your teammates. You've had struggles with authority and people who are in positions of power over you in some way. But it's also important because it establishes that forgiveness is normal. It's something many people struggle with and have to go through daily. It's a constant choice, and it's a process that takes an extremely long amount of time. Every few steps forward you might take, there also might be a couple steps backwards, and that's okay, and that's healthy. But I encourage you to think about everything that I've said today and consider how you can move forward in forgiveness with your relationships. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with, and if you haven't heard anything, please hear this, is that forgiveness often requires time. Reconciliation often requires grace. And peace sometimes requires boundaries. And that's all okay, right? That is a healthy way to navigate forgiveness. And I know this is a process we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks, and it's something that is going to continue to weigh on you for the rest of your life. But as you continue to move through these moments, just think about how you can forgive, how you can reconcile relationships, and how you can set up positive boundaries to protect yourself and your peace from things that have happened in the past. If you will, please bow your heads and pray with me. Dear God, I thank you so much for this day and this opportunity to speak to this group of high school students, Lord. I know you have big things planned for them in their lives right now. It might seem complicated and might seem a little messy, but please encourage them to know that you are in every single moment. And as we've been walking through this 3-week series talking about forgiveness, I understand how complex it is. Continue to take the person or the people that you've placed on their hearts and their minds through this series and just allow them to navigate this challenging concept. Allow them to continue moving forward with forgiveness. Allow them to understand that sometimes forgiveness is more for ourselves than it is for them. Allow them to find the unexplainable peace that only comes from your presence as they continue to navigate this concept for the rest of their lives, Lord. I pray that you just continue to look after us this week and allow us to be safe and healthy before we get the chance to reunite all again next week, Lord. It's in your great name I pray. Amen.